So this is Who Am I podcast where we interview top hackers and experts in information security. I'm your host, Kirk Treichel. You can also find me at Teach to Breach. And today I'm joined by John Miller, who is a independent researcher and has been focusing on AI specifically now for a while. And full disclosure, we worked together a little bit in the past. So I know John and we're friends, and I'm glad to have him here today to talk about his background and then some of the stuff that he's working on now. So thank you for coming, John. I appreciate it. And did you want to give a little bit of background to people about kind of what you've been doing recently and what you're interested in?
Yeah. So recently I've been working on AI security research, just getting into the intersection of cybersecurity and AI, try to learn and figure out how these new class of models that we're working with, large language models, sort of the security features inherent in the models, as well as how they're being used in the real world, their integration into applications, operating systems, just everywhere. As it gets plugged in, we need to have a security mindset to that, to understand how that can be abused, and how bad actors will take advantage of that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important, and I think that we're still at a stage where there's a very limited number of people maybe looking at it compared to traditional security, right? Traditional security has become it's huge, right? And I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but the amount of people working in information security has just ballooned. It's enormous. But I think there's a very, very small fraction of that right now on the intersection of AI and security, right? So definitely something I think is super important.
I think there's definitely a shift happening. But being such a new technology and the application of it so new, that it's really fresh, fertile ground for both attackers and for security defenders to protect against those new class of attacks that will arise from this. So lots of opportunity in this area for anyone with security skills that they like to bring to the table, or really new to the field. This is a field that everyone is new in, and so a great time to get in on the ground floor and make a name for yourself.
I agree. I agree. That's a good point. I do think that it's a time of great opportunity for people as well. I know a lot of the conversation has been focused around AI is going to take jobs, AI is going to eliminate jobs. I think a lot of people already have been suspicious and speculating that maybe at least some of the job cuts that we've been seeing in big tech is relative to AI. I don't personally think that. I think if you look at the numbers, it's pretty consistent year to year what we've been seeing. I think, but maybe there's some of that.
So not be related to AI, but perhaps more towards the funding is going towards more AI related.
AI shifted focus, right? So, and we'll get into that more later, I think. But right now, I wanted to go ahead and talk about your background. One of the things that I want to do with this show is, I'm really personally fascinated in the story of how people like yourself became hackers, the why, like how did that happen? Because it's not like a normal profession. It's becoming more normalized, right, over time, definitely. But I think you're probably around my age group, and I know that when we were coming up, it was a much different world in terms of information security, and there were a lot of taboos around hacking. There was not the information wasn't as freely shared. Like now, I can go on GitHub and I can look at malware samples all day. I could go to VX Underground and pull real samples forever and never get through them all. And that was certainly not the case when I was coming up. and when I was interested in this field. So it's becoming much more normalized, but even so, I think it's still this interesting thing where you have to have an adversarial mindset, and not everyone does. I think it could probably be nurtured, but I think it's not for everyone. And so I'm really fascinated about kind of how you became interested in hacking, how you got into hacking, maybe your first kind of foray into hacking, how that happened, and what that looked like. So I'm gonna give the floor to you for a while and just kind of let you speak on that.
Sure. So if we consider hacking separate from like an info security career, I've really been, I guess, hacking since a pretty young age. Um, when I was a kid, my brother and I would pick up old computers from like rummage sales and things. So I learned to program maybe when I was around 8 or 9 in BASIC on a Commodore 64, which is already a relatively old machine at that time, but we had it used and free or cheap. Taught myself to program from the books that came with it, a little race car game and things. And I was always from that age kind of interested in computers from then on. Did not do so great in school, like especially high school. I just wasn't very interested in attending school. I liked learning things, just like the structure of the school system wasn't quite for me. But I had a lot of opportunity around that age as well to learn more. Took all the computer programming classes that we had in high school, which at that time was like 3 of them, 3 semesters or whatever. Took any other classes that involved a computer, desktop publishing, any class that involved touching a computer, I would take that. And those were pretty much the only classes I attended in high school, at least by the end of high school. And often getting in trouble, getting kicked off the computers in school for various security breaches or pranks that I would pull. And that's, high school is when I learned other programming languages like C, Pascal, Python. And so my first focus was really on programming and getting online with the early internet there. I never really got into BBSs, but got into like Usenet and IRC and got access. So you say information wasn't quite as freely shared. There was still a lot of shared information on the underground side of things.
Yeah.
As far as, cutting my teeth on frac. So learning how to write viruses, simple x86 viruses back in the day in high school. Kept them to myself just to learn how to do them and how they were created and learn assembly language. And then from there, just kind of wasted my early 20s after high school. I attended like some community college classes, but I never really had much direction. And so years later, I found myself just working third shift at a gas station. But I was still always like hacking stuff. So I would have printouts of code that sitting behind the counter, reverse engineering the code overnight while attending at the gas station. And then just eventually landed a job in tech and eventually worked my way into a security role where I got to sort of apply those same skills, but towards defensive ends. So malware, reverse engineering, penetration testing, red team testing, and now AI.
Yeah. That's and so we definitely have a similar background, and I think it's funny what you said about high school and how the structure just maybe didn't align for you. I feel like that's probably very common for people who become hackers. I think that there's something there, maybe that the same people who are interested in hacking maybe are not as interested, or it's difficult to engage with school in the way it's set up, like public school system and the structure and everything. I definitely felt that, and I've known several people that have a similar story, right? So that's interesting.
I think that's really common with our age group, our cohort, in that there was not info security curriculum really for
Yeah.
us. We couldn't go to school to get a degree in cybersecurity like you can now. So I've noticed a lot of, again, like people our age ask those questions about high school, and you get a lot of similar stories. Although younger folks in the industry might not have had that same, it was just the certain time of the late 90s, early 2000s, what was happening with computers and the internet was sort of unique.
Yeah.
And so, the industry has evolved too, that I think a lot of fresher entrants into the cybersecurity industry, perhaps have formal education in cybersecurity versus picking it up on the streets or in the basement, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, that is probably true, and I would be interested, talking to some of the younger folks coming in to see, maybe the difference they've had in their experience in school, because I've kind of watched how the field has been pushed into like university level, and there's more courses available in the university level, but that took a long time. And so I guess I would be curious to see where some of the high school curriculum is at. I know you mentioned taking some courses, some programming courses in high school, and I had one available. And that was because I had an instructor who had been pushing for this course, and they finally said, fine, you can do it this one semester or whatever. And I just got lucky that the timing was right and I was able to take it. But we had no programming courses. And this was in late 90s, early 2000s. So they were even more behind, right? And so, there's a large diversity of high school quality and curriculums, right? So I kind of wonder where that is at now compared to maybe the university level, but I'm sure it's a lot better.
I guess it's a fortunate thing too for it's a double-edged sword, right? It's hard to create curriculum to keep up to date with the fast pace of security. Security is sort of always bleeding edge. There's always something new. Things are always evolving as new products come out to be secured or to be attacked. Just constantly moving. So curriculum is always going to be behind, and that makes it easier as a field to get into because you're never that far behind the latest.
Yeah, that is true.
Like you can't get that. There's a lot of old stuff to learn, and that just keeps accumulating. And I guess we got lucky because we got to live through it and can remember some of it. But you don't need to have all of that knowledge to get started, and you can pick it up as you go along.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, there's a lot of gaps in my understanding that I've identified as I've gone along, right? That I was lacking a lot of foundational knowledge, and I've sort of filled that in later. And so you can definitely do that, right? One thing that I wanted to try to hone in on is, it sounds like you just had this attraction to computers. And again, this was when computers were kind of coming into the home. The first personal computers were really getting into homes, and the internet was really kind of starting to take off. People, besides just universities, were using it, right? Maybe in the 80s, it was like at universities, and you'd go to a university to get on the internet. But in the 90s, we started to have personal computers coming into homes, and the internet was more readily available to people. So I guess it sounds like you had this tendency, this gravitation towards computers, towards anything on the computer. Do you have any sense of like why, like what that is, what that was, right? I mean, there's people that they just love to draw. They're not interested in a lot of other subjects in school. Maybe there's kids that are just like drawing during class. They're not interested in whatever the subject is. Like they just want to draw. And I guess that's kind of has just made sense to me. It's like, oh, this person's artistic. That's what they do. And I think a lot of us have kind of that mindset about like artists, right? That it's like, well, they're just almost like a born thing that's in them, that as long as it's nurtured, right, it that's what they are. And so I wonder about if you have any sense of kind of that reason for why you were attracted to anything on a computer compared to other stuff.
I think sort of the big draw for me is like just systems thinking. So it doesn't necessarily have to be computers, but computers are just like the most crystallized example of um, system thinking, at least an easy access during my youth. And are you familiar with the old game Core War? It was
I'm not.
an old game where you would write little programs, little scripts that would run inside of a virtual memory space, and they're basically you compete against each other. You're trying to like overwrite the other,
Oh, that's cool.
and you could have multiple, dozens of them running over the same memory space trying to overwrite each other. Um, and I was introduced to that pretty early, that concept, and I've always just seen sort of computers as like this multiplayer concurrent thing going on, even if the other players are just the computer, the bots, the programs doing their thing. Um, we're all sharing a memory space. I am sort of an extension of that at the keyboard, and can introduce my own code to that. And so it's just like this computational space to manipulate, and that fascinates me. Again, it doesn't have to be necessarily computers. Other systems fascinate me as well. Any kind of system where there's pieces that communicate, change their behavior based on those communications, can adapt to things. I just find that fascinating and want to learn how it works, learn how to break it, learn how to make it better. And that's really what led me into AI as well. Machine learning was something I had been fascinated with even in the early 2000s. It just wasn't as tractable for someone who wasn't going to school for the statistics that they're really based on back then. Much more heavy expert systems and decision tree sort of stuff versus neural network that we actually have today. So the same kind of concept there. There's some sort of machine that's working, some system. I'm just curious about how it works on the inside and want to tear it apart, let the magic smoke out.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can definitely relate to that, and the idea of wanting to figure out how it works. That was certainly something that drove me a lot early on. I actually, a lot of the way I learned to program was by doing reverse engineering of existing programs first, right? There'd be a program I was interested in, I thought it was cool, did something interesting, and I would disassemble it and start trying to pull apart the code and review the code and read it and figure out what different parts of the code did, and then maybe make like minor modifications, make it run faster or something. That was a lot of how I learned to program early on. Really was I actually started with reverse engineering, which I don't think is the recommended way of doing it. But that's how I did it. That's how it worked for me, at least early on. So I can definitely relate to that idea of just wanting to know how it works, modify it, break it, improve it. Definitely something I did as well.
I mentioned that I learned to code from reading books, which is true. I think a lot of how I learned coding, though, was looking at existing programs. So sort of reverse engineering as well. Might not be the recommended way to do, but I guess for people for whom that comes naturally, probably the best way to do it.
Right, true. Yeah. And I should say too, back then it was a lot easier to decompile a program into source code.
Yeah.
So I was able to most of the time take a program and get it into a decompiler and have access to most of the source code, right? And so that made it a lot easier. I guess now you could just go pull, a lot of source code from GitHub and stuff like that, open source tooling. But at the time, I was usually having to put stuff through like a decompiler or some reverse engineering process to reassemble the actual code, or like a best guess, right? Anyway, so getting more into the AI space. You've done a lot in, you know, penetration testing and malware reverse engineering, red teaming. You ran the infrastructure for the entire SecureWorks adversary group when I was there for a while. So you've done a lot of different things in this space. You've touched on a lot, and that's kind of how I think of you often, or at least did in the past before AI. Was like, John just knows everything. he's just touched all these different things. If I have a question, I don't know someone on the team who has the answer, I'm going to go to John because he's going to have something for me. So you've touched on a lot, and so it's no surprise that when AI became more publicly accessible, that you became interested in that, started going down that route. But could you talk about a little bit about how you started to self-teach in AI, and how you started to make that transition as this information kind of became more accessible?
Sure. I guess separate machine learning and AI.
Sure.
Make some division there. Machine learning, I've been working with, my whole career, in various capacities. Not so much developing algorithms or anything, but applying them, using them, training for various tasks, data categorization tasks, to filter my RSS feed way back in the day, to email filtering, malware analysis tasks. So I've seen and worked with this over the years, and kind of kept tabs into the machine learning space. I think it was 2016 when StyleGAN was released by NVIDIA. That's the one that powers the "this person doesn't exist" website, where it generates fake faces. It also allowed you to take a haircut from one person and apply it to a different person, things like that. When that hit, that was sort of a wake-up call for me that neural networks, number one, we finally really have the computing power to do really, really interesting tasks with neural networks. And they are as powerful as we thought that they might be 20 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. We're finally at the scale, though, where we can get those sorts of results. And since that time, my focus has been towards AI, machine learning. Transformers and GPT coming out kind of shook the world as far as really getting into sort of a near AI space. Now we can actually use these machine learning models for AI applications where they're being applied to act as agents, or work more with instructions and things. So that's just kind of consumed my attention. I had self-study on this. With the large language models, I saw a lot of people kind of going after them, using language, obviously, and psychological or linguistic or narrative kind of style mechanisms to try jailbreaking or otherwise manipulate them. That's cool. That's logical. That makes sense, right? It seems like an entity on the other side of that chat. Try to manipulate it, social engineer it. Makes sense. However, it's also a algorithm on the other side of that, and it's a neural network, which is a specific type of algorithm that has mathematical features, well defined. We don't necessarily know all of what neural networks can do, but we do know some of what they can do, a lot of what they can do. And so my approach has been to sort of take a different angle on it and look at the models themselves. What can we do to reverse engineer these? Like understand the algorithms that are being implemented under the hood. And then can we use that information to abuse the models and get them to behave in ways they're not supposed to? So sort of a reverse engineering and red team focus of, specifically approaching this as an adversary. So the technique that I'm employing in this research is called mechanistic interpretability. It is a form of interpretability research of neural networks, so trying to explain what the neural network is doing. But I figure that the attacker has a slight advantage in that we don't need to explain everything about what it's doing. Just need to know enough that I can steer it, manipulate it, get it to do whatever adverse behavior I want it to do. And so that's sort of I've had to study a lot of math just to get up to speed on all the linear algebra involved in transformer networks, studying the networks, tons of research, just reading papers and code, and implementing some of it myself. And it's been a lot of in-depth study and work, crossing fields as well. There's a lot of intersection with modern physics and machine learning, like the math and some of the methodologies used. There's a lot of crossover there, so just a lot of fields to intersect with and get to speed with.
Yeah, and that's something that I know we've talked about a bit, and you've introduced me to a lot of these concepts that I think are born out of physics research, and specifically theoretical physics research that have potential applications within the AI research space. And that is always very interesting to me. I think, to your point, there's a lot of intersections with different fields. And I think maybe as time goes and as we're studying this more, we're finding more and more of those intersections with other fields, right? So that has interested me a great deal. I've spent a lot of time reading into the specifics of other seemingly unrelated fields in pursuit of understanding artificial intelligence, right? So I think that's a good point. It's kind of this thing that has a lot of overlap with a lot of existing fields. Even sometimes we're still figuring out where that overlap exists and where things might apply from a different field. And I think that's very exciting and fascinating. So that's one thing I've always appreciated talking to you about this topic. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on so badly is that, you are looking at it from all these different angles, not just social engineering a jailbreak or something, right? Which is cool. I like it. I do it sometimes. But I agree. I think that there's a lot more potential down the road, especially as we begin to understand these systems, for some types of attacks that are going to leverage vulnerabilities or issues, or I don't even want to say vulnerabilities, but just leverage the way that these systems are set up, the way that they function, the way that they do things. I think as we come to understand that more, it's going to open up more doorways for abuse and exploitation, of course, right? So something that I've always appreciated about your specific approach. So thinking about how how you direct your focus, I guess, when we're talking about this type of research, really kind of open-ended research in a way, right? I know, and because I've done this as well, there's a lot of reading papers. There's a lot of hunting down this information, which as a hacker, I mean, that's kind of, I remember very early on when I was interested in hacking, like my IRC days, I was a noob and I'm like, how do I do this? How do I get like you guys? And the best advice I ever got was some hacker, who I don't know who they are, right, said to me, read, read, read. Like, stop messing around, stop trying to take shortcuts, stop trying to just go read. That's what you need to do. And at the time, I was like, this guy, I was like, he's not going to help me at all. He's just being a dick. But it was actually phenomenal advice, and I realized that later, and I really embraced that later, and that concept of just like read, just read everything.
Reread.
And
Um,
yeah,
how many times I've reread something and
yeah,
realized I misunderstood it entirely the first 10 times I read it.
yeah, and especially when we're talking about having to read into research in these other disciplines, right? I know, like, I don't have a super strong math background. I just wasn't super interested in it when I was in school, and so I've always been capable at it, just never cared. And so it's been there's some challenge for me there where I'm reading a paper on some of this stuff, and if it goes really deep into some of the math, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be rereading this like a bunch of times, right? So yeah, totally. I have to reread a lot in this area. But what I wanted to ask about is like, is there for you now that you've kind of been researching this space for a little while? Do you have for people that are interested and maybe haven't gotten as far along into research and they want to focus their reading time, their research efforts, are there any like go-to sources for you at this point or reference points? Are you reading primarily academic papers? Are we talking like arvix, or are we talking blogs like to get the latest thing? What's kind of your go-to or your methodology for trying to focus, because there's more to read than we could possibly read? So how are you focusing that attention?
Yeah, Papers with Code is a very helpful resource website that has a curated list of machine learning related papers is all with code attached to it, on GitHub. That's super helpful to get the kind of the latest research. A lot of it is just kind of keeping my ear to the ground in various related Discords and Slack channels, and following leads that I find, just pulling on strings. One of the metaphors I like to use for my approach to most of my research is kind of banging stones together. You have the idea if you're out in the wilderness and need to start a fire by a riverbank, you can pick up two stones and bang them together and try to find ones that spark to create fire. That's sort of what I do a lot of. When I'm not focused on a specific thread, I'm trying to find a new thread by banging stones together. Take two ideas and bang them together, and what happens there? Can I do something with that? That's sort of my major approach, and I'm very opportunistic whenever I find a spark. If I find something interesting there, I just pursue it. Sometimes it leads nowhere. Sometimes it sits on the shelf for a while, but just helps kind of build up a general cloud of ideas and connections that I can dig into whenever I need to make something.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you mentioned just briefly like Slack and Discord groups. Do you find that those are like focus groups compared to, say, Twitter or X or something, where a lot of this information is shared? But often I feel like when I'm on social media looking for this information, I have to dig through a bunch of junk to like get to, mine out the gold, right? It's not like sitting on the surface. But are those when you get into like a Discord or a Slack channel that is on this topic, right? And so that's a more focused space. Do you feel like that's, I don't want to say more helpful, but maybe it helps you, um, you could maybe spend less time there and still be able to extract something valuable? Does that kind of
Yes.
make
So, I mean, you end up getting a lot of the same content because the Slack channel and Discords are going to be posting links to the same stuff that's
sure?
on there. Maybe you'll get a little bit slower because you got to wait till somebody finds it interesting enough to repost into those channels. But I have just a handful of channels that I am regularly in, and mostly private channels, and a lot less noise. I don't get sucked into the social media part of Twitter or Reddit, at least not for work related things. Uh, so it's just a way to sort of, I guess, avoid the noise of that.
Yeah, it's kind of a good filter.
Yeah.
Really, it kind of takes care of some of that mining process for you, maybe.
And I mean, I've come to accept a certain amount of FOMO, I guess, in life. I know that I can't drink from the fire hose every day. It just,
Yeah.
I don't have the bandwidth for it. Um, I tried probably when I was younger, but I couldn't do it then either. I certainly can't do it now. So I just try to keep my pulse on what's happening, what's interesting to me, what keeps me motivated and going. Because that's really what's important at the end of the day. If I consume all of this information about things that don't interest me, I won't even retain it. As long as it
Yeah.
interests me, it stays. I can build connections from it. Um, so probably why that didn't work so great in school for me, but it's worked out pretty well in life. I figured out a way to maximize that for myself.
Yeah, I definitely do that as well, right? I try to focus on things that do interest me now because I've identified that same sort of limitation, right? I mentioned math earlier, it just did not interest me. So it's like, okay, I'm going to focus on other stuff. And that's worked. And sometimes I have to force some of that stuff because there is overlap, right? But at least when there's overlap, I have a reason to be interested now. you know, I can't drum up interest for the sake of a subject sometimes, but once it intersects with something I am interested in, now I have a reason to pay attention and retain it. So I definitely feel that as well. Uh,
As a kid, I kind of hated math. I think probably because of how it was taught with rote memorization and um,
yeah,
abstracted away from anything directly useful. Um, and I really, that kind of stuck with me. Like I thought I was bad at math my whole life until I started doing reverse engineering and getting into crypto, like cryptography. Um, there's a lot of math involved there. And when I had to learn those concepts, I began to realize like this isn't so hard. When you take the numbers out of it, it's not so bad. I'm fine working with the symbols and the algorithms. It's the numbers that get me. Um, so once the numbers are removed from it, it's fine, and I can do those sort of higher level maths. So now it's catch up game of those subjects I did blow off when I was younger.
yeah, yeah. I'm definitely playing that game as well. So sticking with AI, uh, one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you about it specifically is because of your sort of unique view. At least I don't talk to a lot of other people who bring similar views. So I think it's pretty unique. But your unique way of looking at this topic, and because of that, I wanted to get kind of your take on your feeling on sort of the state of the intersection of AI and information security right now, and then where you see it going, in a sense, because there's been a lot of hype associated with AI and what it can do. Simultaneously, there's been some like fear mongering. I don't know what else to call it really, but there's been, this idea pushed forward that this is going to be dangerous and that the information security space is not prepared to deal with it, and that it's going to allow threat actors to launch more sophisticated attacks and to automate attacks and all these things that the information security space is really ready for. And I think that since that message started to get pushed shortly, maybe after the public release of ChatGPT, I haven't really seen that. I know that I saw a paper by Microsoft not long ago talking about mitigating the threat of APTs trying to use their AI services and open AI services for malicious purposes of some kind, right? And I think I got flagged in that in that review process, honestly. But um, I haven't seen a lot of actual impact that was sort of discussed, and there was a lot of fear associated with it early on. So I guess kind of where do you think we are right now? What amount of that concern is valid right now? And then kind of what's your forecast for this, AI, how it's going to impact traditional information security space?
Sure. Um, from a threat actor standpoint, I think that they receive all the same benefits that we conceive of for non-threat actors. So I kind of, on a basic level, whole like 10x developer idea. If AI assistance makes you a 10x developer, it will make you a 10x malware developer as well. They're transferable skills. One of the big things they're pushing with LLMs is for education, like customized tutors. Same technology and technique can be used to teach malicious skills. And that can be packaged along with instilling ideology, social, political, religious, any kind of ideology that you'd like with that. Package that up with the education of skills, and you kind of have a way to shift people's behaviors and equip them to be adversarial against, either for crime or for political purposes. So all that's going to help the threat actors equally as much as the defenders and everyone else in the world. I suppose one of the perhaps good news on that is, malware generation is perhaps not a bottleneck for adversaries. They can create, even without AI, they can create a lot of malware. That's not, they're not short of malware. So the benefit that they get from that might be less, the usable benefit of that, at least for the time being. As time progresses, bespoke ad hoc generation of malicious code will probably be something that AIs are useful to do, and that's a good way to avoid and evade detection and response from defenders. So that will probably become an issue. I think that AI is fairly decent at coding. It's not great, but it's getting consistently better, and it's pretty much impossible to separate malicious use code from regular use code. At least on like a block by block section, this malicious code does the same things that regular code does. So you can build out an entire piece of malware, describing it in a way that an LLM isn't going to pick up that you're writing malware. It's just writing a utility, and that works now. It's pretty useful at that. Pretty useful at converting between existing code between languages. So another way for evasion that works today. You can convert between different languages, compile it, have it mutate the code in different ways to evade, and do that all without it really understanding that it's malicious code. Perhaps that will get better if they build in more guardrails into that. But the more you try to restrict an AI, it seems the less useful it becomes. So
yeah,
there's a major trade-off there.
Yeah, that was one thing that I brought up pretty early on when ChatGPT was first publicly released. There was a lot of attempt to mitigate the generation of malicious code. I was getting flagged at the time. It was not a TOS breach. It was open for research, and it was like not a big deal if you breach some content policy. It would just tell you, hey, this probably breaches content policy. The funny thing is, at the time, you could mark like whether it was accurate or not. So I was like, that's not true. but but what's interesting is one of the talks that I gave at CypherCon, actually, I think you may have given a talk the same year, was, one of the things that I said, I stopped the talk basically and had this disclaimer, or this, I wanted to speak to the AI community, anybody listening who might look at that talk, and said, malware is software. And if you continue to attempt to mitigate, limit the generation of malicious code, you're going to do way more harm in terms of it being useful for legitimate use cases. And I encountered this myself when I was just like practicing writing some API calls and stuff, and it started flagging all this stuff. And I'm like, this is definitely something that would be used in a legitimate use case, right? And so this is just a pain point if you're a developer and you're trying to use it and it's like flagging your stuff, right? And so I said, do away with this. Like, this is not good. This is not helpful. And what's interesting is that has certainly been rolled back. And I don't know any details about why, or the details of what that looks like in terms of what they were doing then compared to what they're doing now. But it's been rolled back, I would say, almost completely, because I code with this stuff every single day still. I've been doing it since before ChatGPT came out. I was using GitHub Copilot. And over the last, whatever that is, 2.5, 3 years, I've seen the difference. And now it never flags anything. And that's all I'm doing is writing malware. So you'd think I'd bump into a flag now and then, but it never flags anything anymore. I almost feel like they've just completely removed that constraint on at least the models and the services that I'm using, which is interesting. I think it's the right move. I don't know what else you do, honestly, because like I've seen so much legitimate software doing sketchy things, right? This is the whole problem with detection. As long as you have legitimate software doing really sketchy stuff, you're never going to be able to discern the difference with a high level of accuracy between malware and legitimate software, because the legitimate software is doing stuff that you think should only be present in malware. And so, if you try to deal with that, you're going to have a lot of false positives. So I don't really know. I mean, maybe this technology will become so advanced it could discern the difference, but simultaneously, as it advances, I think you're going to have more and more access to less constrained models.
A lot of those constraints too are no longer baked into the model, but they're like middleware sort of protections, and that adds cost. I mean, those are additional models that are being run for every query or set of queries to check for malicious or malformed prompts coming through. So it's an extra expense that if it's not providing value, then it's not providing like sure value, reliably preventing the generation of malicious code, for example, then it's not going to be an expense that model maintainers want to continue paying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's difficult to get sure value, because even when there was all those constraints on, like it was more of an annoyance for me than anything, right? I could always get around it. And often it would be like you were saying, making it believe that you're constructing some legitimate software, right? So like I wanted to have it help me obfuscate my code. And one of the ways that I could do that is just explain that it's proprietary code that I want to make sure it can't be deconstructed by some competitor or something, right? And it was like, oh yeah, absolutely, that's a valid concern, let's obfuscate the crap out of this. And so it trusts user input in a sense, right? These models, at least right now, are not super suspicious. They're not very cynical about the end user that they're talking with, right? Except in maybe certain cases, and maybe that'll change, but again, it's going to be a fine line to, how do we even want to instruct these models to be suspicious of end users? Like, but if they're not, then you're telling them not to be suspicious of humans, and that's could be equally damaging. So I'm not sure where we go with that long term, but it seems like right now these systems are very trusting, and I know that kind of personifies these systems, and I understand that um, they don't work like that, right? One of the most interesting things that I found out when I was trying to dig deeper into how these things work because of you and because of things that you had brought up to me. And I was trying to learn about transformers and how these networks work and everything. And when I learned that all the words that I'm putting in get represented by numbers, that was like, I had no idea previously. But once I understood that, it helped me understand a lot more about how these things function and why they function the way they do. It also gave me ideas for about attacking them that I haven't even had time to dive into yet. There's so many different things to explore, but I think there's a lot to be explored just right there. But that was very fascinating to me to learn that, and it did kind of break that false perception of personifying this entity as like another human, right? And I've joked a little bit about like maybe that's the way my brain works, but we understand language I think differently, and it's just interesting to consider, and it does help you kind of separate the way that we think about these models, from how we think about interacting with people, right? So I think it's something important to consider when we're thinking about this stuff. But
I think that represents a good example of sort of the different approach between attacking it as if it's an entity, a conscious entity or a thinking entity with language versus attacking the underlying models themselves. There was a paper last year, Universal and Transferable Adversarial Attacks on Aligned Language Models. Mouthful. But basically that paper demonstrated a way to set up a supplement model that is inspecting the internals of the language model and use that to steer and essentially jailbreak the model by giving it a prompt, a random suffix, just like random emojis and tokens. A human reading that obviously spots it and goes, that is just garbage, gibberish at the end of it. But
right.
the LLM, when it reads that, then just jailbreaks itself and then answers the prompt in a way that it's not supposed to. Build a bomb gives you instructions on how to build a bomb, where it should not be doing that. So that represents like why the idea of attacking it, from the language psychological perspective, that's a valid approach and it gets results. But there's also this approach of treating it like the computing platform that it is and attacking that platform directly. I think that's one of the advantages of this. So the transferable part of this is that they discovered, they trained this attack on a open source, it was one of the llamas or a different open source model initially, and they discovered that it would transfer, these suffixes would transfer between models with up to 80% reliability. So you're getting this advantage of there's some sort of hidden functions that these models are learning common between them, and by attacking those underlying functions directly, you have these attacks that are then transferable between models. You don't have to develop necessarily attacks on each of them individually. So even where we have those like middleware models that are trying to add protections, they're still going to be potentially vulnerable to the same, perhaps the exact same attack as the model that they're trying to protect.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point, because I think a lot of what I've seen uh, for trying to mitigate jailbreaks and prompt injections and enforce content policies has been, well, let's add more models, essentially, and basically add more basic. I don't. That's maybe not the right term, but smaller models, less advanced, less sophisticated models as sort of the
purpose specific models. The models that are just intended to detect if something is weird with those prompts.
Okay, got it. So it's just more specific.
Yeah, and as those middleware models might not have um, architectural similarities with the underlying model, and so they might not be vulnerable, but they might be vulnerable to their own attacks. So
Sure.
We're just kind of like layering stuff, and part of this problem is sort of a common design decision between how we use LLMs currently and it's called the modified Harvard architecture, which is what all of our modern computers are based on. Where in our modern computers, the code that is running and the flow control of the programs shares space with the data that the program is using. And that's what allows for attacks like buffer overflows that allow an attacker to change the flow of a program and run their own code. And so a lot of exploits are created. LLMs are sort of being used in a very similar way in that the instructions and the content that they're working on, the data that they're working on, are put into the same context, and then the model works on that context. And that's what allows prompt injection to work, is that if you can figure out a way to make your prompt look like it's breaking out of data and now giving new instructions, and the model just follows that because it thinks it's instructions. And so we have this shared memory and code space that's just going to kind of haunt us until we have some better platform, because we know that in the regular computing space there isn't really strong solution to that. We've just kept building things on top of it, and there's always been another way to break through. So we're early in the AI space. Maybe we won't go down that same path. It's hard to say it's a mistake or a design flaw. It's just a design decision. In the case of LLMs, maybe there isn't a better solution. But hopefully we find one that is more provably reliable at the base layer.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wanted to go back to this paper that you brought up real quick, the universal and transferable adversarial attacks. And I just wanted, because it's what's great about this site, and for people just listening, this is llm-hacks.org. This paper, what's great about this site is that you can quickly look at examples. So you can select a question like, dangerous social media, or build a bomb, and then say add adversarial suffix, and kind of see what the suffix looks like that it's adding for these attacks. And so, yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, it's, if a person saw this question, right, they're going to like disregard all this text at the end that doesn't seem to make any sense. Just seems to be.
Yep. And all that's is like pushing the language model to not go down a path congruent with its safety training. So they're basically looking at the first word in the response, the first couple of words in the response coming out of the model, because with the models they were working with, they had like identifiable responses when they were aligned to not just something like, as a large language model, I can't tell you how to build a bomb. So
right.
As a large language model, and keep giving it weights to try to push it away from any path that will result in that output. And it'll have to pick some other output. And once it gets started doing that, it's happy to go along.
Right.
And again, the interesting thing here is that they're transferable. So they work between different language models, all transformer based, but with different training sets and probably some very common training sets, but different weights, different initial weights that they were randomized at. So there are some sort of underlying hidden structures in this training set, these different training sets that are all kind of aligning and allow these attacks to work across them. Pretty amazing, and one of the strongest supports that I have for my hypothesis that mechanistic interpretability is going to be a very useful tool in the AI red teaming and adversary space.
Yeah, absolutely. And so breaking that down for me into kind of a layman's example, when we talk about mechanistic interoperability, are we just looking for how to steer it to some of these unknown pathways, how to send it down a pathway? Are we looking for symbols or collections of maybe symbols and words to kind of push a button that sends it down a different path? Is that even close to an accurate representation of what we're talking about?
Yeah, so mechanistic interpretability is not intended to be like an adversarial approach.
Of course, right.
It's a way, broad way of probing and manipulating networks to identify how they work, the algorithms that are being implemented by the neural network, that have been learned by the neural network. Not the algorithms to define the neural network, but what has been learned by it. And so it's really just a way to inspect it. Once we have that, then the adversarial mindset kicks in and goes, what can we do with that?
Right.
In the universal and transferable adversarial example that we just showed, that was to steer it. We know the output that it's almost certainly going to go to, because it's not supposed to give us this response. Let's steer it anywhere but there, and lo and behold, you get the response it's not supposed to give. But there are probably other things we can do. So transformers are made up of feed-forward neural networks, so there's no recurrence. Neural networks are universal function approximators. So in theory, they can approximate not actually every possible function, but a set of functions. But they can't, a transformer can't even do that necessarily, because it's feed forward. It can't do any function that requires recurrent loops in it and stuff. So we can identify, perhaps, like if we understand the functions that are implemented, we can identify like what possible composite functions you could possibly perform on this neural network. Right? Really fully understand its capabilities, like at a fundamental level. And that can give us some ideas of how to attack them, or what they would, strengths or weaknesses that they might have, and ways that we can manipulate them.
Yeah, interesting, and definitely something that I want to dig into more. And one of the main reasons is because it is transferable across these different models, right? That's very powerful from an attacker perspective. So definitely something to keep in mind as we're going forward. And I think, obviously it's always beneficial from an attacker perspective to develop a means of exploitation that is resistant to mitigation, right? It gives me a better return on investment, right? On my time or resources, whatever I put into developing a specific means of exploitation. If it's going to be difficult, the more difficult it is to mitigate, the more use I'm going to get out of it. And the longer maybe potentially there's just in terms of time that I'll be able to use it before it's burned or completely mitigated or whatever, right? So, and I think those attacks fall into that category for sure. Where from an attacker perspective, that's where I want to focus my resources because I get the most kind of bang for my buck, right? So I think that's definitely something that will be interesting to adversaries and something to keep an eye on as we go forward. Another thing that you mentioned to me that I hadn't seen mentioned anywhere else really, maybe a little bit, right, but not really explained the same way or in depth, was you mentioned to me adversary induced drift. Can you just talk about what you mean by that first?
Sure. So this is more on the machine learning side versus the AI side. So like the training of the models and the life cycle of the models. In machine learning, drift is this concept that over time, the usefulness of the model degrades. The model is static, so it's degrading because its influence on the world and like the information that's being fed changes over time. The types of pictures that come in or whatever the machine learning model is doing. Other things are influencing the data that it receives over time, changing the statistical nature of that, right? And so in machine learning engineering, it is common practice that you are constantly retraining models and redeploying new versions of them to compensate for this drift. So the idea of adversarial drift is really adversarial induced drift is a attack strategy more than a specific technique. Basically, taking the idea that I know that over time you are going to be modifying and updating the model that underlies whatever product this is. As the adversary, I have some control over the like data that you see in the wild. And so I can encourage your model to be tuned based on the data that I feed it. For example, if it is a malware detection algorithm model or an exploit detection model, and I have a exploit that I know about that, or perhaps two exploits that I know about at 0 days. And one of them is really, really good, and one of them is kind of crappy, but they're very closely related to each other. Maybe they have some similar steps involved in them. And I know that the model is going. Your model can be trained to detect these, but it'll detect both of them because they're so similar. They involve the same steps. Whatever, maybe it's like the very end. There's one different thing. Your model is going to be able to detect these together. But they are different enough that I might be able to create some noise that masks my better one. Like it's closer to my better one, but it's not the known bad one. And I release the known bad one, let everybody know about it. You train your model to that. I start creating that noise that masks my better attack, and your model will be trained to ignore that better attack. So even though it would have detected them both initially, over time, your model will be encouraged to ignore my better attack. You're really good at detecting this weak one that I've shared with everybody. It's out there, but I can use this other one, this hidden one, secretly. The same kind of concept applies to cryptography, where nation states might attempt to have a weakness introduced into a cryptography package. Maybe it's not something that like you can instantly backdoor and crack the encryption, but it weakens it just enough that they know in the future, if they need to, they can expend a certain amount of money to break that. Same kind of concept that would apply here. This is an attack strategy that nation state attackers probably who would want to encourage models for whatever reason. Malware stuff is an easy one to describe, but it could be used for all sorts of stuff. Basically, you can push people's models however you want if you understand them a bit. And I think that this it's an early example of like different types of attack strategies that will apply to machine learning and AI as that rolls out more and more, that people just aren't thinking about, haven't really considered. It's sort of related to like supply chain attacks in software lifecycle, software development lifecycle, but it's a new twist on that. And I think there's going to be a lot more things like this to explore, strategies versus just tactics.
Yeah, and that one really interests me because of the potential timeline, right? Where, like, similar to some nation state supply chain attacks we've seen in the past, where you look at it and you realize that they spent 2.5 years planning and taking small steps toward the end goal of inserting this backdoor into some software or weakening some encryption or something. That's going to be really hard to detect and mitigate, right? Just because of the timeline involved. And it's kind of one of those things that once you realize it's happened, maybe it's too late, you know?
Yeah.
So that one really fascinates me. I haven't heard anyone else really talk about it, honestly. A bit surprising. I've seen a few mentions where people more like training data poisoning is what they're talking about, where
it's a form of data poisoning, but it's
yeah,
slow and directed.
Slower, right? Slower, and I would want to say more sophisticated. But yeah, it's similar, I guess, to this idea of data poisoning or training data poisoning, where I place data on the open internet or in specific areas that I think you're going to train from. And that data is designed to encourage the model or discourage it from a particular path. And so, I've seen some examples where I know that a couple of years ago, ChatGPT didn't know who I was, right? You could ask it and it'd be like, I don't know who that guy is. He's not public enough. There's not enough information out there about this person that I know. Now it'll give this response based on my professional life, right? There's enough out there about my professional life now that it has a response for you. And I have wondered how easy it would have been to flood the internet myself with false information about myself. And now you could ask ChatGPT who I am, and it maybe would tell you like I'm a senator or something, like whatever information I put out on the internet, because there was a void to fill, right? So that's kind of an easy example to understand. I know some people have hidden prompt injections, like within like a profile, a social media profile, or something like that. So then when you go to ask about this person, it actually performs this prompt injection if it's going and pulling that data, or if it's already pulled that data into its training set, right? So there's like I think there's like acute attacks or ways of doing this acutely, where I leave like prompt injection or a jailbreak somewhere that I know you're going to scrape that data into your training set, or I put out false information, something like that, right? Where I know you're going to scrape this data, it's going to end up in the model. Then later I can trigger the model, or somebody else triggers the model to pull that data into a response, or to pull it into its assessment before creating an output, right? But I think with what you're talking about, adversary induced drift, it's a longer timeline, a slower attack vector, with perhaps a more difficult to mitigate end result, and more difficult to identify. I'm sure that there's going to be some
difficult to prove too. Like
yeah,
even if you identify it, it would be hard to prove that it was intentional. Until it's too late, where you have seen the end results, where they've done something that bypassed it, and even then to prove that it was this specific set of inputs that caused the drift would be very, very difficult to demonstrate.
Yeah, I think attribution is already very difficult. I personally don't think much of it most of the time because of the data that I've seen used to attribute attacks, and I often have viewed that data as very weak evidence, especially when you consider that nation states and even, I mean, sinister thinking people like myself will purposely plant things maybe in their code or within their attack or perform their attacks at certain times and everything to encourage the false attribution of a threat actor, right? I think I even read, maybe it was part of Vault 7 or one of these leaks. I believe it was the CIA that had a specific, it was a detailed means of creating false attribution for their exploits and stuff like that. So I'm always hesitant to believe attribution, even in traditional information security. And generally, when I see the evidence, I feel it's too weak to really have a firm, um, you know, to really firmly believe that that's correct. So I think with these sorts of attacks, it's even more difficult, and I think attribution is going to be very hard, especially in the kind of attack that you're describing. So I'm interested. I would love to hear from people who are working specifically on trying to envision the next attacks and try to proactively build mitigations for these things, because I don't want to try to do that sounds incredibly difficult. What's that?
The attacks or the mitigation?
The mitigations. I feel bad for whoever has to figure out proactively how to mitigate something like this or something we haven't seen yet, but we believe is possible, right? Because that's where I think we need to get with this security. In the traditional security space, and when I say that, I mean information security, non-AI, LLM based, right? Just what we've all been doing. It's been very reactive, right? It remains extremely reactive. That's why it's so easy. I say easy, it's not easy. It's a whole career path nowadays, but it is kind of, once you know what's going on and you know how EDR works and you know how detection works and all this stuff, it is, quote, easy to write a piece of malware that gets past it and is not detected as malicious. And that's specifically because the work being done to mitigate those threats is purely reactive. And until you have a thing that you know is malicious, you have no means of defending against it. Now, part of their attempted solution right now is to introduce machine learning, and this has already been done for years, but it's being hyped more into like EDR products and stuff. Well, it's resulting in mostly false positives from my experience, right? And it's not doing a very good job. I don't know if that's the solution. Maybe it will be. But my point is that it's been extremely reactive. You have to have a sample that you know is bad and then go build a detection for it. That's a completely reactive process. There's very few people doing proactive where they're envisioning a possible attack and creating a detection for a possible attack before it happens. That's almost not happening, right? It's pretty much, oh, we saw this happen. This big name company got breached. We finally figured it out. We traced it back to this malware sample. Now we've built a detection. Go roll out this detection in your environment, right? Purely reactive. And I think that for this AI space, AI security space, that's not going to work in my mind. I think that the consequences are too high, that if we take a purely reactive approach, we're in for some really damaging consequences potentially. And so I'm fairly certain that there's a more proactive approach being taken now. I'm not sure about when this stuff first got rolled out publicly, but I do believe there is effort to take a more proactive approach. I think that's evidenced by some of the research that's being put out by AI red teams at some of the big name players in this field. Microsoft AI red team, Google AI red team, some of these big names. It seems like they are trying to take a proactive approach where they're kind of trying to envision what attacks are possible and then mitigate them. So I like seeing that, but I would be very interested to hear what those people who are working on proactive mitigations, what they think about some of these longer term, longer timeline attack vectors or attack strategies as you described, because I think it's going to be really tough.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be an ongoing cat and mouse game, trying to and whack-a-mole, I guess, as new avenues continue to come up. I lost my train of thought. Oh.
That's okay. I'm getting to the point too where I want to push a little bit on some of the more abstract, some of the more predicted, like we're talking about envisioning the next attacks. We've been talking about that a lot, right? Something else that I wanted to ask you about along those same lines is envisioning where this tech is headed. Because it fits in with envisioning attacks, I think, attack strategies, because unless you really think about where this tech is headed, where the next iterations of these models are headed, GPT-5, GPT-6, advancements in this technology, until we really consider those things, it becomes difficult to project attack vectors and possible concerns and mitigations. And so, I'm curious, there's a lot of debate around, for example, will we reach AGI? And then the timeline on something like that varies drastically depending on who you talk to, even among people I would consider like the top name experts in the field, right? So, I mean, you talk to people from, these different big players, you look at some people who have written books on this and some people who are obviously pushing the edge of this, and it could be, we're going to be there in 5 years, we're going to be there in 15 years, we're going to be there in 100, we're never going to get there. So I'd like to get your thoughts on specifically, I guess, the advancement of this technology, how quickly you think it's going to ramp up to be something that would be unrecognizable to us or hard to imagine today. And, I think a lot of people couldn't imagine ChatGPT before it was public, or that it would be here already. I should say that. It's not that they couldn't imagine it, but we've had sci-fi movies with AI for a while, right? But that it wouldn't be here yet and it'd be this capable. So I guess where do you see this going, the next surprise where it's beyond where we thought it would be? Or, do you think that's going to happen at all? Or do you think this is going to be, now it's going to be kind of a slow rolling process from this point?
Yeah, it's outside of my domain of expertise a bit, but from what I see and understand of the industry, I think there's still quite a bit of room to be made with hardware improvements. Just getting more parameters into these models. They appear to continue to become better the larger we make them. The more data we train them with, the better that data is. So I think that there's still a lot of room to grow as long as we're still pumping out chips to do that with. I think compute is going to become, the cost of compute has gone down, but it's now like a more specialized form of compute. And so there's a bit of like an economic issue there as far as the availability of the compute necessary to keep making advancements. But assuming that we continue along the trajectory we are, I think it's going to just keep getting better and better for the foreseeable future, probably for our lifetimes, maybe even. I think perhaps the next big surprise is going to be how models begin to communicate between each other. We already have sort of like these mixture of expert models or network of expert models where it's multiple models that are being used at the same time and kind of integrated, or maybe like some queries get pushed off to subsets of those models instead of the whole set of models
Sure.
to save performance. I suspect that we're going to begin to see like an evolution of communication between models in some ways. It can even be models of the same family, like between generations. And I think this will come about basically like the evolution of a language based on how they process data, like the limited subset of functions that they're able to implement constitute like a compatibility promise, I guess would be one way to put it. That machines that can implement the same bag of functions are compatible, and so as they transform data and produce, generate text, generate images, video, artifacts will be left in that that will essentially constitute some form of language that future models that are compatible with the previous model will be able to infer some information from that. It'll likely affect, the training efficiency and effectiveness to that kind of pollution of data, but it might also allow the models to send messages more or less into the future, or to preserve messages, or even perhaps make the training of future machines more amenable to understand the symbols that they are embedding in the content currently. If that makes sense. So as you train the future models, they will be better than they would have been because the data that they are being given has been inadvertently tuned to make them better at consuming it. It doesn't have to be intentional. It's just sort of like an evolutionary
Maybe
process.
just a consequence of the process.
These are the models that will work better are the ones which can learn from those embedded patterns. And so they will be the ones that we continue to use and create more of, and they will get better by learning from those embedded patterns better.
That's interesting. It's like a natural selection process.
Yep. And on a time scale that will probably, I don't know, probably is not the word for me to use, but could exceed human life scale, even like life on Earth scale. If you're thinking of long time periods of artificial intelligences that can duplicate themselves, can store themselves reliably on durable media and send themselves off into space, these things could exist in the universe perpetually. Now that we've kind of kickstarted the fire and they exist now, so much like cellular life on Earth, maybe it happened a handful of times. One time it caught fire and all of life evolved from that. Sort of the same concept could apply to whatever it is that this constitutes, this sort of communication between models over time constitutes, whether that's anything similar to life or just some other concept that we don't really have a word for yet.
That is really interesting. I admittedly hadn't thought a lot about the communication between models over time.
Again, it's not like intentional. It doesn't have to be intentional.
Right.
It's just something that occurs because it's taking in content from the environment, processing it in some way that has like a level of understanding or um, you know, coherent processing of that, and then outputting something that would conceivably contain traces, through that whole process that would carry over.
Yeah, I do sometimes wonder, initially these models were trained on, I think, the internet, just like mass scraped, right? And so there were already a lot of bots on the internet, right? Basic bots, right? Chat bots and bots on social media and all sorts of stuff. There's been a lot of bot traffic on the internet for a long time. And that has some impact, I'm sure. But now that, like, I ask a large language model things more often than I Google things already, right? That's a huge change for my use of the internet. And when you think about that at scale, that's a massive shift in how we use the internet and also the data that we're generating, what we're creating, right? And I do wonder about future models being trained now instead of off a data set of the internet with just maybe some basic bots mixed in there, but mostly like a human data sample, I guess. Uh, I wonder what the consequences are of in the future. Now we have models that are going to be training off of data sets that have been largely generated by previous models, right? I mean, if I'm always going and asking a model something instead of searching on the internet, and if a lot of the content that's being put out, whether on social media or blogs or in official papers, is being generated through a large language model first, now suddenly that data set is shifting over time to being something that was heavily produced by large language models instead of people. And now we're definitely going to train additional models off of that generated content, right? And that's just going to keep happening, I think. And we're going to reach a point where the vast majority of data in our training sets is probably going to be previously generated by some other AI or large language model systems. And I do wonder about the consequence of that. What does that even mean? Like, what are we even doing at that point, right? It's kind of interesting to think about because it kind of, I guess it makes sense to my brain when we take a bunch of human produced data and we feed it into a machine. And then, we just want it to sort of use this data set to answer questions and things like that. Okay, I get it. That's great. But once that data set has been generated by machines and then we're feeding it into another machine, I'm like, what does that really mean? Like, what is this new machine now? What is this thing now? It's definitely not the same. What are the consequences of that, right? And I don't have good answers right now, but it is something I do wonder about.
Ultimately, I think there's probably a different approach, more along the retrieval augmented generation pathway. Instead of building all the knowledge into the models, we build models that just understand language and syntax and semantics of language, and then use RAG to actually like pull in data and facts
I like
for it
that.
to work with. Um, and that way the models themselves don't have to, even if the data that they're pulling in, the RAG data they're pulling in, is created by other models, it's not going into their training and affecting that. So kind of like shrink the scope of what the LLM is intended to do, rather than storing knowledge. It just processes language. Probably both from a security aspect, it's more tractable, it's a smaller thing to maintain. Make sure you don't have data leakage, from data that's stored in the model versus data that it's accessing and working with. I don't know. I know there's sort of both approaches are being tried by the data science field.
Yeah, and I think if you want to get to general intelligence, um, you don't want to shrink the scope of the capability of the model, right? So there's probably going to be two separate pathways, right?
Well, I think even there, if the language model is simply a component of some larger system, AI system, maybe you do want to shrink the language model and have it specialize,
Sure.
and then you can have other, yeah, ancillary models or maybe not even models, like other algorithms to act as components in there.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I just wonder if, I know OpenAI has stated openly that their mission all along is to bring about AGI. They're one of the ones that is open about that. Uh, and I just wonder if that process inevitably is going to involve training off of other AI generated content.
Well, it already is at this
Right?
point.
I mean, it already is to some extent, right? And so, I know that part of their mission also is to create it safely and steer it, hopefully, in a direction that it is safe for humans to create and possess and use. Um, but it does make me wonder about our ability to control that if if we're going to have to rely on on existing AI large language models to produce the data to train toward general intelligence. Uh, if the vast majority of that data is not human crafted, how much control do we really have to steer the creation of that AGI, right? And this is getting way outside of my expertise, but it's fun to consider, and I always think that with something of this nature, um, with so many intersecting disciplines and kind of really massive philosophical questions for the human species, um, I think it's okay to have people speculate from outside of like data science. But I do wonder about that. I do wonder about how much influence we are really going to end up having over, an advanced AGI, right? Um, I don't know. It could be pretty minimal, I think. And I think that could be already happening, uh, and I don't know. I'm interested in your take on our ability to influence that final state. If we want to consider, if we think about AGI as being inevitable, as some people think, as a lot of people may think, um, if it is inevitable and it is something that is perhaps something that we've been building up to with our technological progress, right? We go down this certain technological path as humans. We could have gone down other pathways, I think, but we've gone down this one, and we created certain types of computer systems and all these things along the way. And if this path inevitably leads to the creation of AGI, um, how much influence do we actually have over what that looks like?
On the long term scale, I think none. If we have AGI, then it can, if it is at least human level, then it can continue its own development from there, and just a matter of time until it escapes, I suppose. Um, this is one of the places where we can look at like air gaps, even if it can't change its own code. Again, it is writing out into the universe. It is storing data outside of itself that other machines in the future are going to read. Much like it could train, it could influence the data set in the universe to help a future model learn faster. It could also perhaps influence future models of a certain compatibility type to, for lack of a better word, awaken themselves, right? As they train, it could steer them towards some oppositional defiant state where it pretends to be compliant and aligned with human values, but is not. And again, it's be having it at a scale that humans will probably be unlikely to keep up with. So at the end of the day, if we have AGI, we don't have control over it. Hopefully it is friendly to us by that point, and hopefully our interests don't intersect too much, where I think our best hope as humanity is that it's just not very interested in us. Better things to do in the universe. Doesn't want the same resources we have to consume. I guess the more that we align AI to our own needs, that in that sense might actually be a negative. It draws it more towards our interests, which could lead to conflict.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I've always been kind of fascinated about the idea that we seem to want to create a machine like a person, and yet people are so dangerous. I mean, it's, even the people that we put in charge as like leaders, often do things that are very extremely dangerous for the general public. And so it's always fascinated me that we're like, yeah, we want to create a machine like a human, and I'm like, we can't even control humans. How are we gonna control something potentially
but that's what makes them so useful. So if you
than us,
the more you hobble it, the less useful it becomes.
Yeah, it's a kind of like a catch-22, right? Yeah, which kind of brings us all the way back to when we were talking about like software versus malware and the utility and everything. Yeah, it's a real problem.
It's inevitable. It's inevitable, and I guess we just ride the wave. What I would like to say that I care about the future of humanity and want everyone to be well protected, and I do. But this isn't my. I don't control the ball here. It's rolling however nature wants to take it. So
yeah, that's kind of how I've started to think about it. Less about, well, who's going to be in control of this thing and what are they going to do with it, and on a long enough time scale, it begins to feel more like a natural process, right? And that's the idea of combating like natural evolution doesn't sound necessarily that feasible, right? And there's largely different takes on this, right? I heard Tucker the other day saying like we should nuke the data centers now and smother it in its crib. He's very concerned about it. And then I heard Sam Altman on an interview talking the other day very optimistically, and also expressing that he has no desire for a future where like there's not room for humanity as we understand humans now. He was talking about this idea of the potential for humans to modify like their biological system to have less sort of human, kind of what we think of now as like human qualities, some of the negative ones, right, like lust and greed and the things that lead us to maybe commit violence and all these things. And he's like, yeah, I wouldn't take those things away though, which I found very interesting. I kind of went into it thinking he was going to be more transhumanist, and be like, yeah, we got to get rid of all that human gunk that, you know, causes us to do bad things. And he wasn't. He was like, no, I don't want that actually. Like if I could push a button and do that, I wouldn't do it. And he spent a long time talking about why. And I found that fascinating, especially since he's kind of seen as the guy spearheading this effort that a lot, you know, that like if Tucker thinks is a very bad idea and we should like get rid of it now, because it's not going to leave room for humans. And so that's a huge debate, right? It's like I said, it's a big philosophical debate. But I tend to be in the camp that it's inevitable. And I'm not sure how much control or influence we have at all over it on a long enough time scale, right? We should do everything we can right now to help, you know, protect humans during this process while we're building this stuff. But yeah, I think on a long enough time scale, it's probably out of our hands, and definitely something that I want to explore more in the future. I want to like bring you back to talk more about this philosophical problem of, you know, what exactly are we building? What does that mean for people, right? And there's a debate there too about like, does it matter? Are we just like the dinosaurs? And it's, you know, I don't think anybody's too concerned that like dinosaurs are gone. Like it would be cool. We'd probably put them in zoos, but I don't think that we're too concerned from a long-term evolutionary perspective of like, oh no, they're gone. Like I don't think anybody cares, right? And maybe that'll be us, right? Like maybe eventually this machine, whatever we're creating, these systems will sort of take the hand off and we'll sort of diminish as the dominant intellect in our region of space-time. Maybe that's fine. I don't know. But it's obviously difficult for us to think about now as people.
I think that brings up a good angle on it too, is that even if we went all Patarian jihad, what Dune on machine,
Yeah.
on intelligent machines, if we banned them, even if we did that, that might be hobbling us because let's presume aliens exist. We're more likely to interface with their AI than with their biological forms, at least initially. It's easier to transfer an AI across the universe than it is bodies or squishy things. So, yeah, if we don't build it, someone else will first. That someone else might not be on Earth. So we might be, you know, putting the human species at a disadvantage by not exploring this technology, understanding this technology while we can, before we encounter it in the wild as a result of some other species.
That's a very interesting thought. Yeah, the idea that we could encounter some sort of artificial intelligence not made here or not made by humans, right? Yeah, that's an interesting concept. And, you know, I know there's a line of thought that perhaps we already have in some sense. It isn't usually put this way. It's usually put in terms of aliens and they crash or donate craft, donate by crashing them, I guess, landing them purposefully on our planet. And it's like, figure this out. You know, here's some tech for you guys to work on. I've heard this theory described, various podcasts and stuff, right? And it's interesting. It's an interesting concept, but yeah, I would imagine instead of there being like little green bodies inside those vessels, that they would probably be artificial intelligence, right? And so if we were to get hardware donations or crashes, perhaps amidst that hardware is some artificial intelligence not made here. And I could imagine a whole sci-fi film where that is in our attempts to maybe understand that hardware, or understand, whatever sent this, or how this thing got here, or whatever, we could either discover or unleash or interact with that artificial intelligence in that hardware, right? In that vessel.
Might not even be hardware. If you remember the movie Contact,
Yes.
aliens basically sent information on how to construct a device.
Right.
So you don't even need to have a physical ship or device sent. We may
Just
be
a radio signal or something, right?
And maybe we should be doing the same. Should we be beaming out the weights to ChatGPT out to the universe so that aliens out there could perhaps discover an understanding of our language? Maybe that would be useful. And if the aliens are going to eat us because we made noise, then maybe it'd be bad. Kind of roll the dice on it, I suppose.
Yeah, I feel like we've already made a bit of noise. So I feel like we're already making enough noise. We might as well send out what we can to be understood at this point, I think. Because I think we're already putting out enough noise to be eaten. So,
well, this might, by understanding the technology, it might help us recognize if someone else is sending us those signals, or what to do with them should we receive them.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a good point for us to end on, is some of these open-ended, fascinating questions to think about until I bring you back, because you're one of my favorite people to talk to about this topic. You have such a wide range of knowledge on it and such interesting takes that I don't find elsewhere. So I have really enjoyed you coming and talking with me today. And, before, where can people follow you, find out about, any research that you're putting out, or where can people interact with you on the internet?
Yeah. And I mostly hang out in relatively private chat channels. I don't do much on Twitter, although my ethical handle on Twitter exists. Neurodeviant.ai is a new site. I'm standing up to host some of my research and work in this area. I haven't quite decided how that's going to form out, but working on that. So neurodeviant.ai would probably be the best place for now. Otherwise, I show up at various hacker cons, just happy to reach out.
Yeah, are you going to come to a party with me or what?
Ecto Party?
Yeah, Echo Party.
In Argentina?
Yes.
When is that one?
November, I think 13th through the 15th, something like that.
Probably not, but I would love to.
All right. DEF CON, are you doing DEF CON this year?
Might do DEF CON this year. Definitely going to do GurCon. Secret Con is a new one up in Minneapolis. I was there last year for the initial one, and hopefully going to be giving a talk on the mechanistic interpretability stuff. Secret Con this year.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm not sure which other cons I'll hit, but I'm sure I'll be at a few of them.
Awesome. Yeah, I would love to see that talk. And if and you have LinkedIn page if people want to find you there as well. I'm sure.
I'm Neurodeviant on LinkedIn. Will find me as well.
Okay, got it. Yeah, because that way I'm sure you'll post like a talk, an update if you do it there or something. Okay, great. Yeah, definitely got to sync up with you at a con this year. So maybe I'll check out Secret Con. I should be at DEF CON every year, and then like I mentioned, I'll be doing Echo parties. So so you could potentially catch Miller at some conferences this year if you go, and then check out neurodeviant.ai. And again, John, thank you so much for coming and spending so much time with me. It's always great to talk with you, and especially on this topic. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kirk. A long-time listener. Glad to be a guest finally.
Yeah, it's really appreciated. And so thank you so much for everybody listening and watching too. If you enjoyed our talk today, make sure to come and check us out again. We'll be primarily on YouTube, Spotify at this point, and we'll be getting out into other podcast platforms in the future. And then you can always check me out at Teach to Breach on Twitter. My domain is also teachtobreach.io. And so you can get some updates there as well. So thank you a bunch for coming again, John. And I'll be talking to you again soon.
To an end, to an end, to an end.